Chapter 19, Part 2 of It Happened in Egypt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. It Happened in Egypt by Charles Norris Williamson and Alice Muriel Williamson. Chapter 19. If at first you don't succeed, Part 2. So should I, dear Miss Biddle, I assured her, but what can I possibly do in such a very intimate matter? Why, you're a diplomat, aren't you? I thought they always knew what to do. You make us all dance your tune like puppets, and imagine we're prancing about to please ourselves. Tell him he's breaking my heart. By Jove, you're not in earnest. I am. Oh, he must come back. I thought on board the Candace we were as good as engaged. I submitted to his kisses, and now— Submitted is a good word, I sneered to my inner self, but outwardly I submitted a handkerchief to the lady, as she had lost hers in one of the last donkey jolts, and ventured to insert sympathetically into a pause a small suggestion. It was usual, I reminded Miss Biddle, if a gentleman's intentions had to be asked, that the father did the asking. This hint, however, fell flatter than a flounder, and all the way to Abydos, most sacred temple of ancient Egypt, I was persecuted with Enid Biddle's woes, when I should have been free to meditate upon the tragic history of Isis and Osiris. It was here that the head of the murdered god was buried, and perhaps his whole body, when the magic secret of Thoth had enabled Isis to collect the 14 separate pieces Set had hidden. Many temples claimed the sacred body of Osiris, ruler over departed spirits, and Amenti, their dim dwelling place beyond the western desert, Philae and Memphis among others, but it was Abydos to which the Egyptians give their most reverent faith, as the true burial place of the beloved one. It was there they wished to lie when they died and were mummied, in order to rest through eternity near the relic of their most precious god. Thus a necropolis grew like a poppy garden of sleep round the temple, and a city rose also. But even in the long-ago time of Strabo the city was reduced to a village, and all traces of the shrine had vanished. The great white jewel of the temples, Temple of Seti I, and the temple of his son Ramesses II, remain to this day, however, with the tablet of ancestors which has helped in the tracing of Egyptian history. Therefore it is that this treasure of the Nile desert is still a shrine for travelers from the four corners of the earth. After the long, straight road and a high, sudden hill, we came face to face with the marble-white columns of the outer court. If I had been with Bridget or Monty, I could have run back into the past, hand in hand with either, to see with my mind's eyes the white limestone palace of Memnon, copied from the labyrinth, standing above the city between the canal and the desert. I should have peered into the depths of its fountain, and with a hand shading my eyeballs from the sun, I should have gazed at the grove of Horus's sacred acanthus trees, dark against the burning blue. I should have found the royal tombs which Ramesses restored, grouped near the buried body of Osiris. But bad luck gave me Enid Biddle for my companion. She would not let anyone else come near me, even had the right somebody wished to dispute my battered remains with her. Antoun Effendi had the others hypnotized, and I wondered if they noticed how like his boldly cut profile was to certain portraits of the youthful Ramesses, carved in the glittering white walls. So splendid were they that had I been a woman, my spirit would have rushed back along the sand-obliterated, devious paths of Egypt's history, to find and fall at the feet of their original. But there was Antoun, much easier to get at, and perhaps better worth the gift of a woman's heart than Ramesses the Great, with all his faults and cruelties. Crowds of birds lived in interstices of the broken columns, and their tiny faces peeped out like flowers growing among rocks, their eyes bright and arresting as personal anecdotes in a long, dull chapters of history. They seemed to look at me and sympathize, cocking their heads on one side as if to say, "Poor, foolish, modern man, why don't you make a virtue of necessity and get rid of this still more foolish modern maid, by promising her anything she asks? Then you can go listen to that princely-looking person in the green turban, who might be descended from the kings our ancestors used to behold. He does seem to know something about the history of this place, on which we are authorities. The dragomans who bring crowds of tourists to our temple and gabble nonsense put us really off our feed. Peep, peep! Just hear him tell about the staircase we're so proud of. Did you know there was a picture of it in the Book of the Dead, with Osiris standing at the top, like a good host waiting to receive his guests? Well then, if you didn't, do anything you must to escape from that lovesick girl, while there's time to hear a real scholar talk of him who is at the head of the staircase. Peep, peep! Hurry up, or you'll lose it all, silly! Of course, the real staircase is an Amenti, which your Roman Catholics call Purgatory, and no doubt Osiris is standing on it to this day. So I took the bird's advice, and promised Enid to have a heart-to-heart talk with Harry Snell. Satisfied that she had got all that was to be got out of me, she powdered her nose, in the same spirit that David anointed his head, and attached herself to Rachel, in whose train was the desired one. Thus basically did I free myself to enjoy the society of Biddy and Osiris, with lovely carved glimpses of Isis thrown in, to say nothing of Seti I and Rameses II. Trying to push into the background of my mind the nauseating thought of my vow and its fulfillment, I helped Bridget and Monty take snapshots of King Seti, showing his son Rameses how to lasso, and also how to catch by its tail the most fascinating of bulls. They were on the wall, of course, Rameses and Seti, I mean, not Bridget and Monty, but seemed so real that they might leap off at any instant, and so charmed was Monty with Ramesses' braided lock of youth that she resolved to try one over her left temple in connection with an Egyptian princess costume she was having made for some future fancy dress ball. I can't take a grain of interest in any one but Egyptian princes and princesses and their profiles, she exclaimed, then blushed faintly and added, I mean princes and princesses of the past. We got some good pictures of the Temple of Seti, for Monty had an apparatus for natural color photography which gave sensational results in ancient wall paintings, when anyone except Monty herself did the taking. It was better still in the Seven Chapels, the Holy of Holies at Abydos, and in the joy of my first color photography I forgot the doom ahead. Appropriately, the sword I had hung up over my own cranium descended in the necropolis, at that place of the tombs called el-Ka'ab, Mother of Pots. Nobody wanted to see the fragments of this mother's pots, but I insisted on a brief visit, as important discoveries have been made there, among the most important in Egypt. It was a dreary place where Harry Snell strolled up and caught me alone, gazing at a desolation of sandy hillocks, full of undiscovered treasures. Look here, said he, you're supposed to know everything. Tell me why they call seats outside shops and bazaars, and tombs of the ancient empire, by the same name, Mustaba. I explained that Mustaba was an Arab word meaning bench. Then, realizing that it would be flying in the face of Providence not to get the ordeal over while my blood was up, I spoke of Enid. Among the shattered pots and yawning sepulchres, I racked up her broken heart and blighted affections. I talked to Snell like a brother, and when he had heard me through in silence, to the place where words and breath failed, I thought that I had moved him. His eyes were downcast. I fancied that I saw a mist of tears, as a man's slow tears. Then suddenly he opened his eyelids wide, and glared, a glare stony as the pots and as the desert hills. Borrow, he said, I thought you were a good fellow and a man of the world. I see now that you're a damned sentimental ass. With this he stalked off, and I could not run after him to bash his head, because what he said was perfectly true. I was almost sorry that evening, on board the boat, when he apologized and the Nile dream went on as if I hadn't broken it by being the sort of fool Snell had said that I was. In the dream were Nile cities, with crowding houses whose walls were heightened by tier upon tier of rose and white pots, moulded in with honey-colored mud. There were stretches of sandy shore, and green gloom of palm groves. There were domed tombs of saints, glittering like snow palaces in the sun. There were great golden mounds, inlaid with strips of paler gold, picked out with ebony. There were sinister hillsides cut into squarely by door-holes, leading to cave dwellings. There were always shadoofs, where giant soup ladles everlastingly dipped water and threw it out again, mounting up from level to level of the brown, dyke-like shore. The wistful, musical wail of the men at the wells was as near to the voice of nature as the sighing of wind, or the breaking of waves, which has never ceased since the world began. Sometimes the horizon was opal, sometimes it throbbed with azure fire, or blazed ruby red, as the torch of sunset swept west and east before the emerald darkness fell. When our enchantress landed, great flocks of kites, like in form and wing to the sacred vulture of Egypt, flew to welcome us with swoopings of wide purple wings. Their shadows on the water were like passing spirits. And at night, when the Nubian boatmen danced, their feet thudding on the lower deck to the cry of the darabuka, The Nile whispered of the past, with a tinkling whisper like the music of Hathor's sacred sistrum. Gyassas glided by, loaded with pots like magic melons, long masts pointing as though they had been wands in the hands of astrologers, and the reflection of the piled pots as they moved gave vague glimpses of sunken treasure. Denderah meant work for Fenton. There had been trouble there, and tourists had complained of insults. It was the Haji's business to find out whether natives or Europeans had been more to blame, and whether there were wrongs to right, misunderstandings to adjust. But to the rest of us Denderah meant the sacred temple of Hathor, goddess of love, in some ways one of the most beautiful of all the Nile temples, though, being not much over 2,000 years old, it was built upon ruins more ancient than King Menzies. Archaeologists like Neil Sheridan class it as late Ptolemaic, uninterestingly modern. Mrs. East had been looking forward to the Temple of Denderah more eagerly to any other, because she had read that on an outer wall was carved the portrait of Cleopatra the Great. That of Caesarion was also there, as she must have known, but Cleopatra's son was never referred to by her reincarnation, who chose to ignore the Caesar incident. Mrs. East had not yet deigned to mount a donkey, but to reach the temple she must do so or walk, or sway in a dangerous-looking chaise à porteur. Rather than miss the joy of seeing herself on a stone wall as others had the privilege of seeing her for 2,000 years, she consented to accept as a seat a large grey animal, tasseled with red to keep off flies and evil eyes. "Won't you ride with me, Antoun Effendi?" she asked. "I'm afraid. This creature looks as large as an elephant and as wild as a zebra. I feel you could call him." But Antoun Effendi was not going to ride. He had other fish to fry, and poor Cleopatra's luminous dark eyes were overflowing lakes when he had politely excused himself on the plea of a pressing engagement. I felt sure that she would have been kind to Sir Marcus if at that moment he could have appeared from behind the picturesque group of bead necklace sellers, or emerged from one of the huge, bright-coloured baskets exposed for sale on a hill of brown gold sand. I don't know whether it made things better or worse that the grey donkey should be named Cleopatra, but it was evidently a blow when the animal's white-robed attendant announced himself as Anthony. "I can't and won't have the creature with me," she murmured, as I helped her to mount, when she had pushed the boy aside. "Thank you, Lord Ernest, you're very kind, but Antoun ought to have been here. Fancy seeing this temple, of all others, without an Anthony of any sort on the horizon. A pity it isn't your middle name. If you could spare time to ride with me, that would be better than nothing." "I'll be delighted," I said hypocritically, for I had been dying to talk with Bridget about the Monty and Rachel imbroglio, which, as a hard-worked conductor, I had not since Abydos found a chance to discuss. Besides, Biddy had whispered in passing that a letter just delivered at Denderah had brought exciting news of Esme O'Brien. But I was sorry for Cleopatra, and wondered whether I could manage, after all, to hint in explanation of the hieroglyphic love letter, that fatal letter of mine which had stealthily made mischief between Mrs. East and Anthony. I didn't quite see how the subject was to be broached, still some way might open. "I'm sorry about the middle name," I said, "but if I assumed it, like a virtue which I have not, I should be the third person connected with this trip, labelled in some fashion." "Who is the second person?" she asked abruptly, as all the animals of the party started to trot vivaciously through the blowing yellow sand. "Sir Marcus. Surely you've heard that his A stands for Antonius." "Good heavens!" she gasped, and I hardly knew whether it was the shock of my news or a jolt of the donkey which forced the exclamation. Whatever it was, the emotion she felt bound her to a silence after that one outburst. She said not a word, and did not even groan or threaten to fall off when both our beasts broke into a thumping gallop. In silence we swept round that great bulk of rubbish heap, Roman and early Christian, under which lies Anne, the town of the column. Cleopatra did not cry out when suddenly we came in sight of Hathor's temple, honey gold against the turquoise sky, and vast as some Wagnerian palace of the gods. The tasselled donkey, or I, had given her cause to think. Or perhaps she did not consider me worth talking to, as we approached the temple toward which all her previous travelling had been a mere pilgrimage. Still silently, when we had left our donkeys and were following the crowd up the dromos, Harry Snell actually with Enid, thanks to me and the wisdom of second thoughts, Cleopatra's eyes wandered over the Hathor-headed columns with their clinging colour, and over the portal with its brilliant mass of yellow, of dark Pompeian red, and the green blue sacred to Hathor, whom Horus loved, Venus Hathor, whose priestesses danced within these walls in Cleopatra's day. "Oh, this red and this green blue are my colors, I remember," she murmured, and then hardly spoke when I walked with her in the gloom of the temple itself, the rich gloom under heavily ornamented ceilings. She wanted to save the portrait till the last, she announced, until after she had seen everything else, and she didn't care what Mr. Sheridan said about her temple, it was wonderful. I tried to interest her in the crocodiles, which had been detested and persecuted at Dendera in the late Cleopatra's time as ardently as they were worshipped at Crocodilopolis and other places. I joked about old Egypt having consisted of crocs and non-crocs, just as the inhabitants of Florence had to be Guelphs or Ghibellines. I explained carefully the geography of the place, or rather, reminded Cleopatra of it, adding details of the canal which once led to Coptos, where the magic book of the wisdom of Thoth lay hidden under the Nile. I could not waken Mrs. East from reverie to interest, as Antoun would have had the power to do, but my vanity was not hurt. It was only my curiosity which suffered, for I wanted desperately to know whether the donkey had seriously jolted the lady's spine, or whether the news that Sir M. A. Lark was Marcus Antonius, not a more obvious Marcus Aurelius, had fired her imagination. In any case, I devoted myself to her while Monty and Bridget frolicked with others, and I had a reward of a kind. When we had seen all the halls and chambers, and the crypt with its carvings all fresh as if made yesterday, when we had been on the roof where chanting priests had once awaited the rising of Sirius, when I had taken her outside the temple, where blowing columns of dusty sand rose like incense from hidden altars of Hathor, we stood at last alone together, gazing up at the figures of Cleopatra and her son. The wall on which they were carved rose behind the Holy of Holies, where the golden statue of the goddess had been kept, but alas, the figures themselves! Alas, I knew how Cleopatra must be feeling, and I dared not speak. But I did not look. Instead, I gazed helplessly up at that exposed, misshapen form, that flaccid chin. "Thank heaven it's only you who are with me," breathed Mrs. East. That was my reward, or should I call it a punishment? Anyhow, it made it easier for the insignificant person in question to unburden his conscience about the hieroglyphic letter. I stammered it all out, on the way back, apropos of the rubbish heap, which had been Tantira. I let it remind me of Fustat and our digging expedition. I had meant to follow Mrs. East's advice, and propose to Miss Gilder, I explained, but Monty had not found my buried love-letter. What had become of it had never been told. All I knew was that it hadn't come into Miss Gilder's hands, and I should never have as much courage again. "Oh!" Cleopatra exclaimed, with a curious light in her eyes, more like relief than disappointment. "You really do want to marry my niece? You delayed so that I wondered. I wasn't sure, sometimes, if it were Monty or— But I'm on your side, Lord Ernest. It isn't too late yet for any of us, perhaps. Trust in me. I'm going to help you." I could have bitten my tongue out, though I had blundered with the best intentions. "Mrs. East," I protested almost ferociously, "you mustn't do anything. I said before I began that I was going to tell you a secret. I won't betray your confidence, but I will help. I want to. It would be a good thing for Monty to accept you, Lord Ernest, a very good thing in more ways than one. Mrs. Jones wants it too, or did. I promise you I'll be discreet." With that we arrived in sight of the boat. Once more necklaces and scarabs and baskets were thrust under our noses. Anthony had returned from his mysterious whisperings in cafes or mosques in the new town, and was waiting for us. Cleopatra called him, with a note of gaiety in her voice, to help him off the elephant. He came. I felt she was going to hint to him that I was in love with Monty, hint to Bridget also. Virtue may be its own reward, but it makes you very lonely. I hadn't another easy moment for dreaming the Nile dream, and we all woke out of it when, with the pink dawn of a certain morning, we saw a vast temple, repeated column for column, in the clear river as a mirror of glass. We were at Luxor, and somewhere not far off Mabella Hânem was praying for release. End of chapter 19, part 2.